right, welcome everybody. San Francisco #1 Rundeck Meetup. I said #1. It's a very specially picked title. So I thought since this being the first meetup, I should give a little history about Rundeck. And it seems kind of far ago, 2010. 3 years, I guess, goes by fast, but that's really when the story of Rundeck began. So, I don't know, what was big in 2010? For some people, maybe that was big in 2010. He was big for a little while, like for a month, that was pretty big. He was winning, he was winning, he was winning here, he's winning there. But for me, what was big in 2010 was Farmville, Frontierville, Cityville, Castleville, Frontierville, Petville. I think you get the idea. I was working at Zynga at this time. Actually, I was working here for about 1.5 years during kind of the tail end of when Farmville was huge, Frontierville was just coming out, and Cityville was the newest, greatest thing. The biggest game, actually, that Zynga had put out to date. And they kind of ran their company like a movie studio. There was a lot of these divisions were separated. They were very autonomous, and they all kind of had their own groups, their own dev guys, test guys, ops guys. They were pretty separated. And really, everything started from Treasureville, which I didn't find a good logo for. But Treasureville was kind of like the DNA. They took Treasureville and they stamped it out many times and turned all these other villes up. And Treasureville, not only was it the DNA of app code, PHP, memcached, all their special sauce, memqd, but also it inherited all the provisioning, release, deployment stuff. So if you were Farmville, you really were inheriting the release process and deployment and provisioning tooling of Treasureville. And they stamped this out. And in the beginning, it was fine. I mean, for Treasureville, it was probably good at the time when they created it. It was based on Rake, shell scripts, right scale, a little Puppet, some custom shell scripts, parallel SSH, and it was automated. But really, what that meant was it was automated in pieces. This part was automated, that part was automated. So you could say it was automated, but it wasn't automated end to end. Like you couldn't just push a button and say, I want this branch or these versions on these kinds of servers. To do all those things were separate steps. And besides that, they were this kind of company that had separate business units for all these bills, but they also had this new middleware group, this new accounting business system group, and they were building their own services and creating their own deployment and operations practices. And there started to be conflicts, actually. This is when things kind of went wrong. Kind of stepping on each other. Is Puppet in convergence mode or not? Somebody's turning it on, it's opening up a bunch of change on people who weren't expecting it. So there was a lot of mayhem, actually. And right around this time, the company decided what they needed to do was centralize the operations, because they knew that if they kept bringing up another bill, they'd have to hire another, release manager, DevOps kind of guy. DevOps guys didn't exist in those days yet, but that kind of skill set. So they thought the thing to do would be to centralize all that. Makes sense, from a high-level company standpoint, that made a lot of sense. So that's when my part of the story came in. They were looking for a kind of all-inclusive solution, and they said, hey, control tier, that could be the solution. So they called us up. They said, can you help us with some control tier? So we went in there and listened to their problem and started actually drilling into it. This is actually a true picture from a whiteboard conversation of one of their lead engineers explaining the process. And you can see the process over here. It says 3 to 8 hours. This is just to cut the release. And then here's the prod environment. And then for every node, there would be about 3 to 5 minutes to deploy it. But this was a company where every bill had thousands of nodes, so just do the math. Now they parallelized it, but that process was more than a day, and for them that was just breaking their back. That just could not to put any change out to take that long was just intolerable. And so they called us in saying this is a deployment problem. And through later years after this point, I realized that's the canary in the coal mine. It's a deployment problem. The real problem, as we looked at it, was this was a big pain. Deploying to 4,000 servers with a minimum outage is hard, and doing it across tiers is hard. But all this front end stuff turned out to be really where all the problems began. So they wanted to pick a branch, and they needed to smoke test it in QA, and then they needed to distribute it into some repos, and then they needed to push it into some S3 buckets, and then they needed to kick off all their scripts to Akamai's stuff and download it to their servers and stage it and deploy it and all that stuff. All these parts were automated. Remember that. So like this part would be a little automated, that part would be automated. Every one of these kind of lines was so-called automated, but it really never worked. And there was a few things that was really hurting the business. First of all, besides the length of time, it took so many people. Like all the lead engineers, the top guys that knew the ins and outs of the app would have to be available. And that pulls them off feature development time, and they're always under these crunch, to get the next version out. So that was a problem. The other thing was, it totally hit the SOC. They called it the SOC, you might call it a knock, but it's the same idea. And it'd be all hands on deck. So every change was all hands on deck. It was very manual, really, at the end. And so this was the deployment problem as they saw. So by drawing it out, this is before DTO got into value stream mapping and looking at things very analytically, but just getting people to visualize on the whiteboard, we could see that while the deployment problem was hard, it was all this kind of coordination of all these other steps that were on the front end of it that were part of the overall delivery process that made this so painful. So there we were in April 2010. Now what I did is start to think about this like a software problem. How do we break this down into steps? And start to think about architectural tooling. Like I said, they wanted us to bring in control tier. Control tier was this comprehensive solution. It had modeling, it had orchestration, it had a package repository, it had this modular automation framework. But knowing the culture of that company, I was very concerned. I was very concerned that it wouldn't scale, not just for technical performance reasons, because it's a massive scale at that time. We're talking 20, 30,000 nodes, but mostly for organizational scale. How are you going to get people to adopt that much learning curve? And also, it just didn't feel very, I'm using the word lean now, I didn't use the word lean then, I don't think, but it wasn't very lean. It wasn't just a simple thing. It was, you had to learn a lot to do something. So by breaking it down into these kind of architectural components, repos and build servers and system packaging. System packaging was a radical idea over there. They had a kind of proprietary TGZ custom packaging format. And I remember getting in all these kind of academic debates with people about the merits of system packaging. You can't package application code, that's insane. It could never work. Anyway, we took them through the thinking of it. And then introducing this idea of a job ops console. I don't remember who it was. I think it was somebody in Mafia Wars or Poker, but they said, oh, what we need is the Jenkins for ops. We need the Jenkins for ops is what we need. And that idea really kind of helped present it in people's minds. Like once that word kind of got through, they started to see, oh yes, we need this kind of push button thing, but not for devs. We need that push button thing for ops. And that's really what this job and ops console thing came from. And you can see here, we talked about the process, from this job and ops console. It was kind of centered here in this diagram about all the things that needed to coordinate. So it was really it was really more of a workflow conversation at the end. That's how we really started talking about it. It wasn't so much an automation at the box level. It was cross-box, cross-tool, cross-process. And to think about these processes in reusable chunks, that was another idea, because we were trying to centralize ops at the same time. We were trying to get some kind of consolidated way of automating or have a strategy for doing it. So that led to the very first POC. By the way, that first stage took 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks. And by the time we kind of got some consensus around an approach, we implemented it. We actually implemented the POC in 10 days. It was pretty, and I thought for us that was pretty amazing time frame. And we got the ops guys to stand up Yum repos, Hudson, before it was Jenkins. We defined a specification format, because one of the things they really liked about Control Tier was specification driven, model driven. So we came up with a YAML specification format that would define software stacks and platform stacks, and some kind of recipe layer for how you do automation. We got everybody to buy into an SDLC. That was another kind of wild, crazy idea. You know, for the ops side, it was like, what? I got too much stuff to do. I don't want to check stuff in. I'm not a developer or what. And so that came into it. The other thing was they use RightScale like for everything. To bring up nodes, for auto scaling, for monitoring, to just run ad hoc procedures, you name it. I mean, RightScale was the silver bullet to the point of abuse. And but it was the thing that spun up all the nodes. So one of the tenets in our what we call the loosely coupled toolchain philosophy was don't repeat yourself. If something knows the data, don't create an alternative database that has the same data. Just get it from the authority. So that kind of authoritative source of truth idea came from that experience too. And we decided that this job and ops console, since it was going to be the Jenkins for the ops world, needed to be driven from the authority of truth about the infrastructure. So we tied into the RightScale API for that. The other thing was they were using parallel SSH pretty effectively, actually. They had their own kind of tagging scheme. It was pretty custom in how they used parallel SSH, but they liked SSH. SSH wasn't a problem. They thought, lowest common denominator is how RightScale was going to talk to everything. So use SSH was the point. The other thing was realizing that data comes from more than just the infrastructure. Data comes from outside sources. What builds do you have? What choices should a user get? How do you inject that kind of data that's not about the infrastructure into process automation? So that was another key point. And then, of course, leveraging this whole system packaging idea to deploy not just the third-party packages like you'd expect, but also the app packages. And this dovetailed into the RightScale provisioning. So before this happened, imagine you would spin up a node with RightScale, write scripts with some server template. Some of it would be RPMs, and then you'd pile on all these TGZ files. Nobody really knew what versions were on there. So by bringing on these RPMs into how we built the software stacks, now everybody had a single view, a single way of managing dependencies, a single way of publishing and distributing. So, and this was really the future of Rundeck. This is where Rundeck really became its own. The very first, we piloted this on Treasureville, but the very first game that Rundeck actually managed was Cityville. And right after the POC, I want to say about a month or two after the POC, they said, let's go live with this on this new game, Cityville. Nobody knew how successful Cityville would be. They pre-allocated 800 nodes, which is what they did for any game, 800 nodes. You could just get 800 no matter what. They blew through 800 nodes in like the first 6 hours. And it got to 10,000 nodes in 4 weeks. That was the ramp on that game. And scaling Rundeck through the brand new project Rundeck on that sharp curve was not easy, and it was pretty difficult, but we deployed Cityville on Rundeck. So I became a believer in the loosely coupled toolchain after this. As being part of the Control Tier project, I thought, oh, you need a top to bottom solution. You need to have all this kind of computer science approach to making a management system, but realizing the challenges of a company like Zynga and seeing it's not just a technical tool thing, it's an adoption thing, which means simplicity. This was really my first proof that convinced me that the loosely coupled toolchain really is the most powerful pattern. And I stand by that 3 years later. So that's sort of the history of Rundeck. This is Rundeck 1.0 that we're talking about, and I'll show you what's happened recently in its kind of journey. But the problems that you hear there, I've heard elsewhere in other kinds of companies, but I want to kind of generalize some of the other problems that I've seen in talking to Rundeck users. So I'm sure everybody identifies with this. If you're in a software project, relative time given to the teams and work, right? So most of the time is taken by development. I've given too much time to testing here. This is very fantasy land. Sometimes that doesn't exist. And then there's ops, which on top of being kind of the last to get the request, they're also very interrupt driven. So ops isn't just having to deal with all these non-functional requirements at the last moment. They have firefighting to do, they've got maintenance to do. There's all these things that are challenging their time on top of it. So in ops, you have the last minute to get things done, and at the same time you're juggling all this other stuff. So you don't really have much bandwidth. That's the problem in ops, is you don't get much bandwidth. So that was, I think, something that I've heard quite a bit. The other one is, what's life before you really automate stuff? When I say automate, I mean fully automate, end to end. It looks like this for a lot of people. It's a README file, do step 1, then do step 2, and then go find the other README to find out what else you got to do, and you're dumpster diving. That's how I feel like you're basically dumpster diving onto all the extra information you need to get the job done. So that's, some people call that a run book. The other one is a spreadsheet, the deployment plan. The deployment plan has a spreadsheet, looks great, it's got tabs on it, there's people's names, there's tasks, there's times, there's contact info, deployment plan. You know, it's better than a README that you have to dive into God knows how many folders and sort of build this picture in your mind of what you have to do. It's easier to quarterback this, but it's not automated. And then there's this is the catch-all. Some guy is going to tell you what to do. First you do this, then you do that. And then when he doesn't know the next thing to do, you call the next guy and he tells you to do this and that. So this is pretty typical, pretty much everywhere. And of course the problem is that this doesn't scale. This doesn't scale across the team, it doesn't scale across projects, it just doesn't scale. But it's amazing how many people do this. One of these or all of these things. But very, very commonplace. Here's another one. You've got a lot of tools out there. Specialist tools. So there's like the village engineers got their tools. You've got release people, they got their tools. You've got guys that manage the infrastructure and the servers, they have their tools and so on, right? Everybody's got their tools, but if you look at it from an end-to-end release process, you need to coordinate across these tools. That's what makes it hard. So each one of these islands is automated. It's got automation, but the problem is how do you automate across these things? That's really what makes it hard, and that's what really slows down the delivery cycle. The delivery cycle is really slowed down because of handoffs, and I know this because I've analyzed it now. I've analyzed it many times formally, small and big companies. This is the nut of it, is that handing off between all these silos and tools is what makes things hard and slow. And that's just for one team. So stand back, you've got more than one business unit. And this is the truth of any big company, is that you've got islands inside each business unit, and if you're the VP of engineering, the CIO, or the product manager, you have to cut through all this stuff. And this is really the complexity of process. So that brings us to why Rundeck and the project vision. Project vision is really to, first of all, create visibility into all these operational tasks. So how does all these point specialists publish the way they do their job in a way that can be reused, in a visible way, that they can see how it's used, and the people who need to run it can see what they're running. So So that's one thing. The other one is, and this is a term straight out of lean thinking, is to turn information flows into what we call artifact flows. That basically means code in our business. And this idea of a job in Rundeck is really an example of code, rather than the do this, then that kind of documentation. And then, this interface layer that you can build on top of all the tools. You can think of it almost like a middleware or an integration layer, but the idea of an interface that you can put on top of the tools so you can connect them, that's another part of the vision. For managers, they're always concerned about who's doing what, when, and where. So you got all these disparate tools. You could build that kind of functionality into each tool, but if you can expose them to this higher level, it makes it easier for managers to see what's going on. So that's another part of the vision. And then there's this new idea that we've been really thinking a lot about, and that is operations as a service. We need another AS here, right? We've got infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. We need another AS, so that should be operations as a service. And really what that comes from is, instead of you taking a request to do something like a mechanical Turk and getting it done, anticipate the kinds of things people want from you and be a service provider. And that's a huge change. That was a huge change for me, because I was a tools developer thinking, problem solved, software. Another problem, another tool. That's not really connecting dots though. So seeing yourself as a service provider was a huge eye-opener for me, and I think part of the vision of Rundeck too. So this operations as a service is a key point. If you want to say the umbrella idea of the project, it's that. Everybody here, well, for a couple of exceptions, knows what Rundeck is. It's a server. But besides this idea of a service provider, something that I found pretty cool talking to other users was that Rundeck actually increased trust inside companies. Being a techie, I never really look out for this kind of thing. Trust, and I asked what do you mean trust? Trust meant that if I'm an app developer and I need to turn over some kind of automation to the NOC, how can I do that in a way that I can trust they're going to do it right? Or vice versa, if I'm in the NOC, how can I trust that I can take on some automation from somebody else and plug it into the way I need to run my business? That's kind of trust. And you get trust through visibility. And the other thing that comes with trust and visibility is freedom. And so freedom comes from the idea of I don't need to ask you anymore to do it for me. By getting this self-serve model, this operations as a service idea, that's really what gives freedom. And those three, I didn't put the word freedom in here, but those things kind of took me aback. Like, wow, that's a good idea. That's a reason to have a project. And it's significant to the business. It's an organizational thing. It makes the work easier to do. And then this last one, mean time to button. We heard this from some users. In the Jenkins dev world, basically that's what you get. Mean time to button is pretty quick. I need to set up a build. Easy. I set up a project. I put in my source code repo, my build tool. 10 minutes? I got a button. So that same idea for ops. What's the mean time to button? And more than that, and I would say much more than that actually, is that it should be a user-friendly experience, because when ops is delivering this kind of self-serve, they're delivering it to the kind of users that app devs do. They could be project managers, they could be testers, they could be a business guy. So it's gotta be easy for them. Now, I think Rundeck 1.x had a long way to go on the user-friendly part, but I thought it was very eye-opening for me to hear that the success of an automation developer was how fast they could build the UI in front of their customer, so that there was no back and forth. The back and forth killed the deal. So if the guy who needed to push the button said, you know what, I need this kind of choice, and I need to see this kind of output, if that developer left a day, a week, or 2 weeks, he might have lost that customer. That customer might have said, I'll find another way. So that mean time to button is more than just putting the button in place. It's giving the user experience so that in a collaborative, quick cycle way, that makes sure you got an adopted, solution. Adoption is the hardest part of automation when you're rolling it out. It's not implementing it, it's getting people to use it. So those are big lessons, and those things are all powering the vision of Rundeck development right now. Of course, everybody probably knows it's a GitHub project, Apache 2 license. I just go through a few of these kind of use cases. This first use case is one that I was sort of alluding to. You know, here's a story where app devs need to come up with some sort of restart procedure, and let's say that the ops guys, the admin guys, had their own way of doing it. By sort of collaborating around this in terms of a job that was a piece of code, they could then turn it over to the NOC and avoid the run book, basically. So this is a pretty common, maybe this is the most common use case, is this one. You know, the idea of notification is a pretty key point. People need to get notified, so especially when something like a restart happens. This is another, maybe close second, is zero-click deployment. This is another pretty common use case in Rundeck. You know, somebody checks in whatever project they have and whatever CI tool they have. It does a build, it publishes something in an artifact repo. Maybe it doesn't publish it in a repo per se, but it's available in the CI build server, and that triggers a deployment or some kind of release process inside Rundeck, and it interacts with the things below it. So it could interact with something that spins up nodes, and then tools like Puppet Chef, CF Engine, SaltStack, and whatnot. You know, you can see there's a resource model here. This is like that Zynga story. You know, what is the authoritative source of knowledge about your infrastructure? It's the thing that brings up the infrastructure, and then node execution. This is another, you know, plug-in point for Rundeck. You know, there's different ways that you might need to do that, depending on the kind of box you're talking to or the kind of thing you're managing. And again, you know, the whole notification part is another key point there. Data processing seems to be more common. This is kind of an increasing use case now. Big data solutions, so not just bringing up the boxes, but actually managing some of the data processing work itself. In fact, if you look back at runbook automation in the 90s, this is one of the main use cases of it. File transfers, ETLs, all that kind of stuff. So I guess it shouldn't be too surprising, but it's coming up on our radar more now. And this is another one. Testers don't need a box, they need a whole software stack. They need to bring up a certain version or branch, and just coordinating all the top to bottom of that, that's a pretty bread and butter example of Rundeck. One of the things that I was mentioning about going from a tool developer to a service developer is, and you guys at Salesforce are actually a good example of this, is the surprising number of users. I can't say for sure, but I want to say about 40%, this is just sort of a gut sort of estimation, don't ever see the Rundeck GUI. It's just a service. And they're using it for different reasons, but they're just building their own tool framework on top of it. And there's some examples here of different companies that are doing that. But you know, in the end, there's some kind of integrating middleware that ties into Rundeck and other tools. And Rundeck may have some custom plugins in here to talk through their other tools to the stuff that what else they're managing, and have their own custom GUIs. Actually, you know, I'm a little self-conscious on the Rundeck 1.0, GUI. It's pretty crude, and very impressed with what other people have done on top of the service layer. So I've taken inspiration from it, but some pretty slick stuff actually I've seen that wraps Rundeck services, and it says a lot, I think, for the Rundeck web API. I mean, it's simple enough to consume, and people are treating it like a black box. All right, so demo time. I mentioned kind of in passing the 1.x versus beyond, and hopefully because of my system crashing, it will cooperate. I want to show you guys 2.0. So this is the very first presentation of 2.0. There was some technical debt that we owed on the 1.x code base. Basically, we upgraded all the software stack below Rundeck, so it's now on the newest Grails, the newest Groovy. It can run on the newest Java. There's a number of dependencies that have been upgraded. So There's a little bit more work to do there, but it's pretty much overhauled under the covers. It does seem faster. We haven't done any real benchmarking yet, but not that's the only reason. But we're on a good new foot. On the UI, we've got on all the bootstrap theming here. Maybe some of you can recognize it. So hopefully it looks a little bit more professional. For anybody who's gone from the pre 1.6, you'll notice that these tabs are the same. For people who haven't gone on to 1.6, we've changed things a little bit. So we used to have the Run tab and the Jobs tab in history. We're kind of going through this consolidation stage now. Everybody's pretty much told us universally that if they're looking at the GUI, it's there for jobs. So jobs are the first thing to look at. The other thing is very limited people use ad hoc commands. They wanted to go to the Run page to look at nodes, and then they go to the nodes page and it'd be one node on there by default, which was the Rundeck server, and that was like a big pain for them. Like, what? I thought I had 20 nodes in here, or whatever they had. So we've turned the nodes view into a nodes browser, and you can you can still do this kind of stuff. Run your ad hoc commands if you have the right ACL policy. This has become if you had to pick one page to know what's going on in your world, this is it. You just push auto refresh and it will look out for whatever work is going on. So let's see if everything else is working here. I was going to show you guys a continuous deploy process, but it looks like there's something wrong with this. So I wanted to show a couple of things. So has anybody seen the 1.6 version? No? One?
Are we using 1.6?
I think through the
Yeah.
Okay.
1.6 beta, I think.
Us one. Yeah, so we've tried to make things a little bit more user-friendly. In fact, let me show you here. So one of the things I was saying earlier was that the user experience is a really key part. One of the things that people want to know is, I don't know what step this was when this output came out. So we're actually going to do much more beyond what you're seeing here, but here's the node and then the step. And the idea is that, if I'm the end user, I can just flip back and forth like, okay, what's this job supposed to do? It does these 6 steps, and I can come over here and say, okay, there they are, it's one-to-one. So presentation things like that is one thing. The other is, actually let me get to a better job of this, there's a huge range of how people implement jobs, but for some, they do a combination of stuff like this, inline scripts, and the pre 1.6 version just had an HTML text area. So this has an ACE editor, and you can see that it's easier to see. In fact, I put this demo together last day or so, and it was amazing. I got an error. It said error line 10, and I went to that and I was like, oh, line 10. It helped me debug it. So that was pretty cool, and that kind of thinking is basically driving what you will see eventually, and that is things like, imagine there's an error on one of these steps. You'll be able to click on it and go to that step and see what it is and drill down to that implementation. So we're trying to speed up the bug fix problem resolution. And one of the things that we've heard from the service providers. So if you're a company that provides an automation service to an end user, their end user will run a job and they're like, hey, it blew up on this. And they have to ask the end user, what are you seeing? And that really becomes our requirement for how we design the UI. Design it in a way that the end user can explain it to the automation engineer easily enough that all the dots connect. So we've just sort of scratched the surface with what you're seeing right now. We're going a lot farther than this, but that's kind of the key idea is to speed up that communication cycle between the people who create the services for the end users.
So the third line there where top says 3 stop, 3 stop.
Yeah.
Where's the word stop coming from? Is that the command being executed?
That's
or is
actually
that
a job. So, yeah, so if I go over here, I can click on it from here, and that's the definition for stop. So this example is it deploys a Tomcat, a couple of Tomcat instances. Actually, this is a good thing to talk about. This is another one of these kind of cool ways of using Rundeck. So when you think about a node in Rundeck, you're probably thinking about a host with an operating system on it that you're managing some stuff. But that doesn't stop people from saying, no, a node is anything. And this is I actually am reflecting this kind of thinking in this demo. So there's this node here, app1. This is actually a box. And you see these other nodes, app1, Tomcat1. These are actually services on that box. This is a modeling of services on the box. And an app1, Tomcat1 is really just some instance on the app1 box. But what this lets people do is, okay, let's say I want to do things just to the Tomcat1 instances. So I can say, well, for example, that actually went to app1 and app2, but it was targeted to a particular user on that node. So not everybody uses users to isolate deployments, but I did it in this example because I talk to people who do it this way. They have a box, let's say it's got 16 cores on it. They just load it up with many instances, and each of these apps have their own users, and they kind of protect each app from each other from the user space. And they treat each of those deployments like a node. And they can deploy to that node, they can stop that node, they can get metadata about that node, and it's pretty powerful. In fact, that's how this whole demo works. So when I'm deploying this simple app to the nodes, I'm really deploying it not to the app1 node, it's actually deployed to the services. On each node there's a Tomcat1 instance and a Tomcat2 instance. And the deployment uses the metadata here. Catalina base is different on Tomcat1 than it is on Tomcat2. It's a pretty simple example, but you can see there is key information. In fact, the deployment process relies on all this stuff. How do you know if it's healthy? You ask the node for its app URL. And I've seen some pretty creative stuff with this. Like I say, users that have to deploy more than one thing on a box. This is kind of a favorite trick to do. And they can also manage layers of their infrastructure this way. So yeah, so node is not necessarily a physical box. It can be something kind of like a pseudo node. I don't really know what the right way. I call it service oriented, for lack of a better way to describe it. All right, how are we doing on time? What do you guys think? I mean, for anybody who's used to the old UI, is this a step in the right direction? Is this looking better?
It's nice.
Looking better?
I have a question.
Yeah.
What about in places where there's restrictions about who can do what, like developers do certain things, the DevOps people do something else? Does Rundeck implement any kind of access control?
Yeah, it does, and I thought I had. Let's see if it will work now. Maybe it will work. Okay, cool. So yeah, I got an example just for that question. So I'm logged in as admin. Admin can do anything. I can literally do anything Rundeck lets me do. This admin user has that access. So I'm going to log out as admin, and I'm going to become. Oh, before I log out, I should point out a few things. So you see, there's a play button in front of everything. There's a. Oops, pull my back in again. There's an edit button. I can see all the nodes. So take it from me, this admin guy can do everything. So I'll log out of that guy, and I'll become ops. So first I'll become ops. Let's call him knock, because ops isn't really the right term here, but no more edit buttons. I can still run stuff, but I can't change stuff. So let's pretend in the story is this is the knock group. They're not supposed to change the procedure. It's just to work with somebody to change the procedure. And let's log on to that guy. Let's become dev. Okay, so let's say in this story, devs are allowed to check the status of stuff. You know, it's okay to, you know, there's no harm in checking the status. Let's just say that you know, doesn't hurt anything. So devs can check in on things, get visibility with the ops is a big thing that I think is important. Devs have as much visibility in production as anybody else because they're writing code that goes there. So they can check status, but they can't restart stuff, but they want to see the history. Because let's say the knock guys, maybe other people are running the restart. Maybe there's a flaky app that keeps running out of memory. They got to keep restarting it. So they're allowed to see the history.
So the history for all the jobs is actually displayed though. If you go back one page, we can see the promotion history as well.
Ah, good eyes, yeah. I need to tighten up my ACL.
Can you use LDAP, an LDAP environment with this so that you can do your authentication authorization in groups that way?
Most people do use Active
Yeah, we
Directory
use it
LDAP.
that way.
Yeah. Let's see, there's the last one here. Okay, here's the last one. Here's RelEng. They're only allowed to run the promote job. So there's a language, I'll call it a language for the ACL policy that maps a group to a set of resource actions. So resources are things like job, ad hoc command, resource, events. The things that you see in here are what you can manipulate with the ACL. And on the authentication authorization side, there's a few different ways you can do it. LDAP, Active Directory, is of course common. There's a PAM module. You can go through PAM. Some people write custom. People have written single sign-on because they have their own proprietary user directory service. That's a plug-in point for Rundeck, but typically, you know, I see Active Directory LDAP as the predominant thing for managing the group membership. Any questions? Yeah.
How can you achieve the rolling upgrade kind of thing in Rundeck? If I want to do a rolling kind of a restart or rolling upgrade kind of thing.
There's various strategies. So I didn't really say much about it, but there's this notion of tags. So the first thing is that you classify your servers into groups, and then you know you're basically targeting groups at a time. You know,
Just static way of
yeah, there isn't like this is a roadmap item, but a roadmap item is to do by percentages, for example. There's another dimension to it which we call ranking, so you can sort inside groups. So there's a lot there, but it's not like I said, a roadmap item of doing it kind of on a percentage basis. There's a plugin system now for all the workflow steps. I don't have an example of that, but that's another way of implementing your own strategy. You can just basically not use the built-in Rundeck dispatching logic and just implement your own workflow dispatcher. So, but that's not out of the box.
So you guys have simulated any distributed systems deployment via Rundeck? Like, for example, Stack or something like that?
Hadoop?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of those, I was mentioning the data processing use cases. I think Elixir is one of the, they built Hadoop deployment on Rundeck. So I haven't personally done Hadoop deployment with Rundeck, you know, as kind of my own project, but yeah, that seems like a growing use case for Rundeck.
And one last question, maybe it might be a dumb question. So is it passwordless SSH or?
That's up to you. That's probably the easiest way to go. That's a plugin point, firstly, I'm going to say. That's what we call the node executor. Out of the box, SSH is built in, but there's mcollective, you'll hear about Sultan. That's a plugin point. You can decide how to manage the SSH. If you don't want to use passwordless, there's built-in support for prompting username and password. There's also built-in support for sudoing beyond that, so you can do multi-hop through the built-in SSH layer. So, but yeah, I mean, the general answer there is that's a plug-in point, and there's certain kind of out-of-the-box functionality as far as SSH goes.
Where's this node list getting populated from?
This one here is self-registration. So when the VM comes up, it phones home to Rundeck and
To run Rundeck.
do it. Yeah, these are pretty trivial
Cloud
examples.
script or something like that.
Pardon?
To a cloud init script or something like that.
You can call it a bootstrap script.
Can that integrate with maybe like another external system that has all this infrastructure data?
Yeah, I mean, normally, I shouldn't say normally, many cases, it's Chef or Puppet that spin up the box, and Rundeck is actually pointing to Chef server or Puppet master to get all the information about the nodes. That's a plug-in point.
It's like a YAML file you get?
There's YAML or XML. That's a plug-in point. Also, how you format the we call it the resource model into Rundeck. So that whole layer is very open-ended. But it's interesting talking to different users because I'm sort of the mindset that it should come from something like Amazon. There's an Amazon plugin, for example, that will give you all the EC2 nodes. I mentioned RightScale earlier, but there's a surprising number of users, not a majority, just a minority, that want to maintain the resource model in their source code repo because they're a data center, things don't change as much, and they want to own the model. So I was just working with a user last week, and the first thing they did was git clone right on the Rundeck box, and it pulled in everything. Pulled in all the jobs, pulled in the resource model, and a script to push everything back and forth. And I was like, really, you don't want that in a database? They're like, no, that's not what we want. So how you manage the resource data is, maybe it just depends on the kind of work you're doing. But Rundeck does not have its own database, let's say it that way. It's got plugin points to feed it, but it doesn't have it. That's actually a question, for everybody, because we do get some requests from new users like, hey, where's this is great, you got, what was called the run tab before, but now you got the nodes tab, where's the plus button to push to add nodes? So there's an API to do it. Why isn't there a button to do it? So I'm not quite sure what the right thing to do is. We may do it just because there's enough requests for it, but it has an SDLC ramification.
So if you go back and define a job, so
Yeah.
you're editing that's a sequence. You're writing a script effectively and chaining these jobs together.
Could be a script, could be plugins, could be other jobs. Yeah.
So this list of jobs that you're running in sequence that you're defining here, how's that version controlled and managed?
Internally to Rundeck, you mean? How does the workflow system manage it?
So
Or?
this is so that's
Where does it store itself?
that source itself, right? And it's
In the database.
It's a sequence of tasks, so it's in the database.
Yeah.
And that's versioned and skip back and forth. Say what happened to this
For every
resource.
job that you run, you store a copy of the definition that was the execution. But Rundeck does not version it. So this has been kind of a philosophical question for me because so there's really two kinds of users. There's the one kind of user that are interactive users. They log into Rundeck and they poke around and get something working. And then there's what I'll call the service delivery or service provider users. And that's code for them, so it's they might use Rundeck interactively to get a definition, but then that's committed to source repo, and then they have a release process to push it around to Rundeck. So Rundeck has an archive that you can package up a set of jobs and move it around like it's a zip basically, and this is the correct promotional model. You've got a bunch of Rundecks, you've got a dev and a QA and a prod. You're working through all your automation in dev. A build artifact is the archive that you can then push into all the other Rundecks. So the other Rundecks are operational Rundecks. People take the interactive editing away from those. They're controlled servers. So versioning in that point is part of like the software. So Rundeck database doesn't version it itself. So like RightScale, they will create a copy basically of the old write script and call it, version next, whatever the last version was. So no, it sometimes comes up, but I think the typical answer right here is they're using SDLC when that becomes an issue. But this actually brings me up to another roadmap point. So the roadmap point here, which is job libraries. So I'd say the majority of users have some set of generic solutions. I've heard all kinds, and they build other jobs on top of them. And right now, they have to load these generic jobs into each project that needs them. This kind of sucks because you're basically duplicating it. It's not much of a maintenance problem because they have this automated way of loading them, but it just kind of smells bad. So, so one of the things that we're doing in 2.0 is to have this idea of a job library and version libraries. And so we've been talking to some users that want to work in this way. And what they really are asking for is, I've got AppStack major version X and AppStack major version Y, or call them processes, it doesn't really matter. And they want to write a job that selects what version of that overall automation code set that they want to use. So, so what they really want to do is they want to have version libraries of all the automation, and then build jobs on top of those that pick from the versions that they want. So that sounds, I don't know, that's one way we're talking about it. The other thing that we're talking about on these job libraries is really to present the jobs in a library like a plugin, because that's essentially how you could look at them too. I don't have an example of a plugin here, but each plugin has its interface. It has inputs in it, and it has kind of like what it wants to start, and what it's going to do when it's done. And jobs are like that too. So these job libraries are kind of like projects with jobs in them, but they're freeze-dried, they're read-only, and they should present themselves in a way like the plugin system presents custom job steps. So that's another way we're kind of thinking about refining the reusability is through that. So kind of on the early stage of the job library concept. But the other thing that's been a real headache for users is good SCM support. You can load jobs on the server, you can dump jobs from the server, but I think a natural workflow is, I'm just pointing my IDE on some files and I'm manipulating them, and I just go to the Rundeck thing, or I use a command line tool and tell Rundeck to do something about it, and just to basically make that workflow seamless. That's probably one of the highest priority things that we're going to do for 2.0. And then there's a number of APIs that we want to add to the set that's already there, but mostly Rundeck administration. Most users at scale have multiple instances with many projects, and they need to manage their configuration, manage plugins, jobs, whatnot, everything. And there's some gaps in the API that have been filled with some kind of point command line tools, but we're going to extend the API set to really help those kinds of users, and other plugins also that I just put ++ there for other examples. So, and then you might have noticed we talked about a little earlier that the Run DMC thing, we were actually going to pick a logo here, so that's the working logo. I don't know what you guys think about it, but I think it's pretty cool. All right. I think I'm kind of over time, but any other questions?
Yeah, maybe a couple more minutes
Yeah.
for questions. Do you want Ellen? Do you want to start getting your laptop set up? Actually, my personal pain point is kind of developing the workflows. It's like you make sure the long workflow, 10 steps, and then something breaks at step 5. But there's no way to easy way to jump in and skip some steps.
Yeah, kind of breakpoints or skip or
I don't even need to be here. You guys are
Covering all
my
the
whole presentation.
Yeah, presentation points. Okay.
No, it's awesome. It'd be great.
No, yours is a good example. Yeah, actually, that's another idea that we've heard before. Also, is to skip and also stop. Like basically insert breakpoints or skip over steps. It could be that that certain steps aren't going to work because of environment conditions or who knows what.
Right, it'll temporarily
Right.
turn them on.
Yeah, that's definitely on our list.
And how big is your team?
Well, we got 2 full-time and a few part-time on the Rundeck development. And we're getting... The plugin system is pretty new, so we're starting to get more plugin contributions.
Do you feel like
Really
you're
small
getting
team.
traction as a open source project?
Well, I'm learning to be better about it. So, Rundeck kind of started off as a project to, solve some business needs of our own, doing consulting. And I hate to say it, it was kind of back burner, for the paying gigs. It was a cool project. We used it where we could use it, but April was really this past April is really taking it off the back burner and breathing life into it and really starting to treat it like a regular open source project, if you will. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. You put energy into something, you start to see feedback. So that's pretty cool. And hearing some of the use cases, big customer uses, and kind of how they're applying it. So yeah, I think although it might have started its history a few years ago, I kind of want to say that it sort of got a start, and now we're really going to take it forward. So positive sign so far.
Any other?
I was going to ask Alex, what are you doing with Rerun, and where do you see Rerun and Rundeck interacting with each other? Or
That's funny. Does everybody know what Rerun is? I have to admit, Rerun for me is this fascination project. It kind of came out of, I don't want to go whole history on the Rerun thing, but
because it's kind of funny. I mean, if you look at the tool set we use and the way we're using use fabric, right? If you look at the way we're defining our overall tasks and fabric and what it kind of almost sits halfway between Rerun and Rundeck. No GUI, no ACLs, no any of the other things, but I've got a procedural language and it's so easy to check it out. And Rerun's kind of all the way on the other side. Like, what's the easiest possible way to build this set of things? So it's kind of it's an interesting blend.
I think Rerun's biggest problem is me. It keeps proving itself to me. I keep being like, how could this be a good idea? And it keeps proving itself. Actually, it's funny you say that because I was working with some users, Rundeck users, last week, and they said, I got all these loose scripts, it's flavors, variations on theme. Have you heard of this Rerun thing? And I'm like cracking up, like, yeah, I've heard of it. And what do you think about that? And I'm like, yeah, you could clean up all your scripts with it. And it was supposed to be a 5-day Rundeck automate everything. And it turned into 2.5, almost 3 days of rerun everything. And what they really did was they rationalized all that kind of lower level automation with rerun modules. And then the Rundeck part was like super clean. It was just building on all these things. And then they were saying, you know what, we want now? We want a plugin system from Rerun to Rundeck. And I did it just to see what it would be like. And so, I don't know why I had this real issue with Rerun, but it's like, oh, that's actually pretty good. I don't know. The jury's out. Maybe I'll do a demo with it. With Rerun.
Rundeck too.
Yeah, I mean the
Meetup
two
number 2?
together. Yeah. So maybe more beer.
Thank you. Do people need a
wanna take a
quick
couple
bathroom
minutes,
break,
everyone
or
can-
should we just jump in? All right.
All right, cool. So, Rundeck and Gigantor. I'm Alan. We introduced ourselves earlier. So let's see what we're covering. So a little bit of what I was going to cover is Alex talked about a number of different plugin points, and so I was going to cover a little bit of our solution and how we plug in to some of those various points and how we've used Rundeck. So, okay, it's spelled right. So I'm going to introduce really what Gigantor is, talk about some of the components, Salt and Kingpin being notable ones. We spent some investment in security, applying security from our existing infrastructure on top of Rundeck and how we did that. And then sort of go into, known unknowns, future directions, whatever you want to call it. Some of which, honestly, you touched on, so hopefully some of these you'll just tell us that they are now known knowns. So Gigantor. So this is our internal project. As Phil had mentioned, we spent a while kind of researching various technologies before we decided where we were. So this is really our orchestration solution. So we have a ton of in-house tooling that we've been running our business for a decade on it. It does a lot of things, and I think the points you touched on are very much why we selected Rundeck. Things like loosely coupled components, having a higher order language that can call out, we can actually do the transition with existing tooling and sort of stabilize some of these workflows and make them repeatable, check them into source control, test them, and do a number of other things that are provided. We have a lot of operators going to the data center to do things. And I think one of our larger visions that we're hoping to realize is everything goes through a software development lifecycle, right? So it's right now very easy for us to, we have some good tooling where people do log in and execute things within, and we want to take that out. But we also want to make it so people they have an easy way to make changes in production globally, repeatably, auditably, without just logging in themselves and fixing it on the one box. I mentioned that it sits atop other tooling. So that's kind of the motivation of what we were trying to build. And please, this talk's gonna be pretty quick, so feel free to jump in with questions. So components. Rundeck, notably, I'm actually not going to talk too much about that because hopefully we all know what that is, but please ask questions as they come up. Kingpin, well, actually, let me talk about Salt first. So Salt Stack is our distributed execution engine. As you mentioned, Rundeck has the default parallel SSH. It's got a plugin for Salt Stack. I'll talk about that in a minute. The way we were looking at it is, we have tens of thousands of nodes right now, and we are conceiving on how to get to hundreds of thousands of nodes, and how can you execute workflows across that reliably and get it distributed. Salt's got a pretty good solution for that. If you want to drill in, Phil can go into some of the history on how that particular decision was made. But we've actually got all of this integrated right now. I don't have a demo for you, but I have a couple screenshots. So Kingpin is our front end. So again, going back to that little box Alex had with here are all the plugin areas, we also did the custom front end. Let's see, what are some of the... So right now, this is our human interface. A lot of what we want Kingpin to be is we want to automate our data center more. And so we're definitely thinking ahead with like APIs, and right now we're going to have, right now it's all manual. User gets in the data center, executes a command line, and we're going to pull that into a workflow where a user now logs on to a web UI and does it. Well, going forward, we want to integrate that with potentially monitoring. So we can actually short circuit the obvious paths of, server's down, I want to restart it, I don't need a person, I just need an audit trail on that. So we're doing a lot of APIs around Kingpin. So Kingpin is definitely wrapped around the Rundeck APIs, and it itself is going to expose APIs as well. And then a lot of it, which the new Rundeck UI looks really nice for this, is we do want constrained execution. We definitely want to make sure that not only do people log in and they're constrained to the authorizations that we want them to have, but it's presented in a language that makes sense to them, right? Because we have different people doing different things in the data center. Even he showed all the groups of the different islands, and the expertise that people have, they want to see things in their language. So that's why we opted to do a custom front end for that. And then Rundeck, of course, like I said, sits in the middle. It's the workflow engine. It's the best one we'd found, why we selected it. And it's the system of record. So, these other things, Salt and Kingpin sit on front, but what's going on in Rundeck is, that's our system of record. That's where we want to see what happened. That's where we're going to do audits. I'll talk a little bit later about some things that I think we're hoping to figure out how to make that nice and reliable too. So Salt, I think it already came up that someone on our team developed a source node step plugin. The GitHub link is there. You can find it pretty easily if you search for Rundeck Salt on GitHub. So when you put this guy in, you got the little circle, you get a couple of options, you fill those out, and this will actually execute all out through Salt API, and then you're into the Salt ecosystem. So whether we have some ideas about Salt and Syndic and distribution going forward, but at the simplest level, this bridges the two. And some of the interesting things about this is the plugin actually, when you call out to Salt, the plugin actually can sit there monitoring Salt. It knows how to pull for what nodes we're distributed to. And there's plenty of documentation as well on the plugin. So Kingpin, a couple of things about Kingpin. We talked about how do you know what nodes to target and how does that work. So with Kingpin, we've built a front end. So the thing on the right is Kingpin, the thing on the left is Rundeck. So when you do node targeting, you actually do that within Kingpin. So I don't know, is this a good, oh wow, sorry, I really can't read that. So we have additional concepts besides just nodes. For instance, like the top thing there is data center. And so the way we select nodes, because there's a large number of them, a list isn't really going to work, so we have them broken down into Salesforce relevant concepts. So we have things like data centers, of course. Pod is another construct that we use. So when you're targeting, some workflows can target a pod, but if you want to actually target an individual node, an individual host, you can actually go through data center, pod, and then get the relevant list of hosts there to narrow your targets. Some of what we've done here is we have some custom naming. So the Kingpin UI will pick up, you can't read it here, but that says data center, and that says, well, I can't read it here either. I think that says, oh, that's a super pod. So the idea being the Kingpin UI knows how to reach out to our inventory system. So when it says this workflow requires a object data center, it makes the right call out to the inventory system and puts the relevant list of data centers. Based on your selection there, it subsequently says, oh, super pods. So it filters this selection based on that selection. And so that's just some of the keywords we've built in there to make it so, again, when our operators go in, they're seeing data that's relevant to what they're trying to do in a language that they're familiar with. What I said before about where do the resources come from, we actually expose a API endpoint on Kingpin. So when Rundeck dynamically says, what are my available nodes, Kingpin is invoking the Rundeck API, which is checking the nodes against the Kingpin exposed API. So right now, that's just a really convenient way for us to sort of tie into our inventory data with keeping the loop just between Kingpin and Rundeck. It gives us a lot of options going forward. If you want to target 100,000 nodes, we don't want to be blasting 100,000 nodes back to Rundeck to validate. We can actually know what it's calling back on and filter that list and do caching and all sorts of other things. So the security. So of course, we already have a data center full of operators and release engineers. We already have security models in place that we need to build on top of. So one of the things is both Rundeck and Salt expose, they can use an LDAP plugin for authentication and authorization. So what we set up here is Kerberos has been, in our data centers, that's how our operators authenticate. So Kingpin has a plugin into Kerberos, so the operator logs into Kingpin, he authenticates directly with Kerberos, we identify who he is, and then in doing so, we create a dynamic and ephemeral set of credentials in LDAP. So we basically generate a user on the fly. So while you're logged into Kingpin, you get a set of users. Then we use those set of credentials to actually auth into Rundeck. So, and again, that connection is really through the API, right? The users don't ever see it. But that way, when Rundeck is checking against, is this a valid user, it's checking against a set of credentials that were dynamically generated basically for that session. So they're very ephemeral, they disappear, go away. So we have a really nice way to convey down through Rundeck and Salt Stack dynamic users. We don't have to provision. We provision in Kerberos, it gets provisioned in Rundeck. Then additionally, Salt has its own set of considerations. I mean, the great thing about the Rundeck API is once you've auth to it, you've got your token for however you have your configured time schedule. Of course, there's a lot of things that are going on Salt that may need to authorize back, depending on what the workflow is. So those credentials can be more long-lived. And so Kingpin itself actually monitors Rundeck to say, when a user logs off, it removes the credentials. It monitors how long runs are going to make sure that the credentials are available to Salt. So if at sort of step 7 it needs to reauthorize, those are still valid credentials at that time. So this is the security model. So open issues. There's a whole bunch of them that we've sort of identified, and we have, not that we don't have any thinking around, but that we still feel we need to be solving, which is HA, DR, and recovery. Right now we have really great answer for Rundeck sitting in the data center. We've got a lot of proof of concepts of things working. If that data center were to go away, how do we very, transparently switch over? I mean, especially the more we pile into Gigantor, the more we're putting on top of Rundeck, we even, and especially the more we automate it, it can't just be someone gets a text and we do a VIP switch, right? Even that is probably too slow. But we also have to make sure that, the job you just kicked off is very immediately transferred over into a store system that's available in another data center or another area. Streaming progress output. So the way we have Salt Step working right now is we get streaming output from Rundeck, step by step in the workflow. But once we call out to Salt, it kind of ends there. We know that Salt is executing, but we're not getting the log output of any operations that it executes. Dashboard. So one of the things that's interesting is, I think you pointed out in your talk that it's not just the operators that want to know what's going on. I mean, obviously releases, all the developers want to know. And this may not even be developers that are writing the workflows themselves, but it's actually, everyone throughout the company, especially, like we have a whole release manager process. How do we keep the security of the operators being within the data center and secured, but then exposing it in a meaningful way, especially across a large number of nodes? So that's one thing we're thinking on. Workflow contribution is another one. We do want to be able to empower everyone throughout, we're building a platform, that's the sense. So we want to empower everyone throughout the organization to build on top of that platform, but at the same time, we don't want to make it insecure or uncertain as they're doing it. We don't want to make it without testing and verification to be able to get in production and have an operator say, oh great, here's this new workflow, let me hit that right now, when it wasn't vetted through, what might have worked in your test environment may not actually be safe for production, it needs to be vetted. And how do we do that in a sort of a large organization, even not just through different products, but we do acquisitions, so there's all different business units and things that, may not have full understanding of how they operate within our data center. Breakpointing came up as one. When we have a workflow that's well-defined, but there's an intermediate step that requires going out to another system that may not have an API endpoint or just some form of human interaction. How do we do that? Workflow composition considering partial failure, rollback. I think we'd love to hear more thoughts from you guys on, if I run a workflow and something fails in the middle, I can rerun the workflow. But that requires, of course, that the workflow pays attention to, I set up 3 of my 7 steps. Well, do your workflows end up with a ton of check code? Is that the right way to do it? Or is there, is there a better sort of pattern to leverage here? Reusable workflow components, I think you touched on this as well. We're gonna have, I think, what are we targeting? Thousands of workflows. How do we allow people to build on increasing complexity of workflows and leveraging I want to do something, maybe it's interfacing with a load balancer or checking, the status on a metric. And that might be a very simple workflow that you can execute. And then, of course, you can compose these into more and more complex ones. And so what's the right way to encode those in Rundeck? I mean, one of the things I think we were unsure about is, what's the right way to sort of bubble up options? If you have a workflow that has 2 options and then it's composed into a workflow that has its own option, and as it goes up the chain, how do you do that intelligently with naming? How do you know that the value that's specified here actually flows through as the same value in all these downstream workflows? And then solution for asynchronous callbacks for Salt operations is if we do really want to run something across 100,000 nodes, right now we're doing polling of the salt, of what's going on in the salt master. So how do we, is that the right pattern? How does that scale? Or is there a way that we can actually sort of throw something out into a queue and then have Rundeck take it back in a queue? And again, like I said, many of these things we have thoughts on. Some of them the answers might be fairly apparent, but these are just kind of where our headspace is. So I forgot my thank you slide, but that was pretty much what it is. Does anyone have any questions about these points or any of the earlier stuff? Awesome.
So the HR/DR recovery, we're working with a very large mega Wall Street bank on that. And they have actually set up a 4-node Tomcat cluster in 4 data centers, and they're running it hot everywhere. And what they've done is they've got Oracle Rack on the back end of it, and they wrote some custom Tomcat session sharing on the Rundeck side. They haven't contributed that to us yet, but they have it working. So, and they're a global company. They won't let us say who they are in public. Maybe in private. In any case, so it looks like a viable solution, and we want to basically make that part of an offering of some kind. We want to get the implementation of it. So that's encouraging. They had a before that they had a kind of a poor man's, well, I wouldn't say poor, but they had an HA solution which was bit-based, and I think for the reason you said, they can't communicate anything. It has to be any site, any place as a good place to run it. So they came to that same decision. So that's one thing on that. The other thing was, I know what you mean by trickling down the options down to the various layers, because I've been building more plugins for Rundeck for various, customer cases and just experimental cases, and I've found the same thing. Plugins are so much like jobs that they almost, I don't know yet, from a design standpoint, there's some abstraction above that. And I'm finding the mapping, like when I call it up here, makes sense at the end user, but there's an input that this plugin needs that makes sense for the plugin's perspective. But how do you map these things down, especially across steps and layers of the workflow? So I've gotten into that problem now. The other thing was, I was noticing in one of your screenshots you had with the credentials.
This guy? Previous one?
This one, yeah.
This one?
That one there. I noticed it had was it one before this?
Oh yeah, with the salt.
Yeah, okay, salt, API, EOF, all that stuff. The end user doesn't need to, the person that writes a job wouldn't necessarily need to know those things, right? I mean, the person that's managing the salt layer knows that, but the guy who writes the job doesn't necessarily need to know that, right?
Yes, that's... No, you're right. They are not going to need to know that. I mean,
so this is a place where I found plugins to be pretty useful, because you can hide a lot of that kind of configuration data in the Rundeck configuration, and so basically you can hide all that stuff. You can push all that kind of configuration stuff into the Rundeck config, and instead of having a job, this could be a place where maybe a plugin makes sense. So the plugin would look in the Rundeck configuration and get that info, and only present whatever options that the guy who writes the job would need.
Okay. I'm not the guy who wrote this, so you might even say
this is the plugin actually. So this is the salt step plugin. So we can certainly abstract that out.
Okay.
I think if that's an option we can do in the plugin development. So we can definitely talk to the developer who put this together to see if we can strip that out and pull that into their configuration.
I mean, for sure, at some level, whoever's actually writing the input workflow, the job, there's no way they wouldn't even know these things.
Yeah.
Right. Number one, I already pointed out that 2 of them are dynamic, and the other 2 you would have no way of knowing as a workflow author, nor should you.
Yeah.
One of the things we've been kicking around is, do we need a DSL for actually composing these jobs? right? We've worked on some custom user interface to create the jobs as well. You know, we've definitely done a bunch of stuff with the Rundeck UI, but I think we're kind of kicking around if, you know, are there even some higher level concepts that could effectively compile into the underlying workflow?
Yeah, I feel the same way. It kind of gets verbose. It feels like a lot of boilerplate. So yeah, some programmatic way to do that.
Which is also nice because as you add new features, you can go back and change your compiler.
Yeah.
And the DSL still lives.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Any other ones you've already solved that you can tell us about? This was our number one excitement, is that we were going to come here and you were going to say, these aren't problems, what are you talking about? So that's what we're looking for.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the workflow contribution, the library, and the plugins. I've been getting deeper and deeper into plugins, that's why I guess I keep talking about it. I think that's a new avenue for creating the reusable tasks. And I've been looking at other job, I call them old job automation systems, where all these tasks were, there's a huge library of them, and there's canvases you can drag all this stuff out on. And they were all single step items. And which is nice for the guy who writes the job, because they're just looking for functionality. And I think that there's two levels of how you define the functionality. One is a process, but you know, the other part are these little point tasks like, you know, bring up this VM, or check, you know, ping it, or I mean, the granularity of them is, you know, is whatever you can imagine. So you can have this, you know, kind of lower level libraries, and the plugin system, I think, fits in that layer. And then there's the process reuse, which you know, we call a job or a workflow. And I think that's sort of a solution type of reuse. And that's where our thinking is on the job libraries. And talking to other users, it sounds, I mean, feels like there's a convergence in that kind of layer, or thinking about that kind of layer. In the, I think it's 1.5.4 or 1.6, no, I think it was 1.5.3. We added the error handler. You guys are just starting to use error handler. So I've been starting to use the error handler more too, and I was hoping to have a demo of it today for rollback, because I've been using it in sort of a simpler sense. So like, try to do something, a single step in a job, and when it fails, the error handler tries to really do it or bail out. But actually the demo I want to do is a rollback of a botched deployment. So you start the deployment and something goes wrong, and then the higher level rollback rolls everything back to the last known state. So I think there's a primitive there, but I don't think there's like good examples, and maybe there's some gaps still to do that well.
Well, we were just joking about that today. You know, what happens when your rollback fails? When your rollback fails,
Oh, yeah.
right? You know, there's, you know, it's
That's
turtles
true.
all the way down, right? Like once things start, step one, remove access. Step
Yeah.
two, restore access.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's where you're going to need the breakpoint too. I mean, in some cases you might say, I could possibly do a theoretical rollback, but I should probably ask somebody if before I
Yeah,
really
the
try.
run home to mama button for
Yeah.
sure. That's a good one.
You know, I've been playing with the error handling. We get a little bit of conditional logic in there, and it's nice in that you can pretty much, you can do basic logic with it, but there's sometimes where just aesthetically it's painful seeing that error message show up in the logs when you're actually handling what isn't an error state, it's just a decision state.
Yeah. I think we should fix that. I know exactly. I mean, I used to have this pattern. I call it assert pattern. So assert the condition I want, and so the condition could be it's running. Assert running, and then I'd have like an error handler that would, if it's not running, try to stew it.
Right.
And that's a pretty cool little pattern. But it's not cool if assert, the assert doesn't pass the condition that it's running, and the end user goes, "Oh my God, there's something wrong."
Mm-hmm.
No, this is the way
Right.
this is my logic.
That's
here.
exactly it.
Yeah. So I think we should just set.
I mean, wouldn't it be as easy as just having a box that says this is not an error,
Right.
like, or don't alert as error, like make it a notice,
Or just call it conditional and have a button to say handle this as an error.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about the visualizing the output or getting the output from Salt and other tools. We talked to someone recently that was a heavy chef user, and he was like, yeah, I got my automation in hand, but having that visualization layer to show people what's going on under the covers was something that he wanted out of Rundeck. Didn't really know exactly how he wanted it, but that was where he wanted it to go. So whatever your thoughts are, especially related to the work you've already done with Salt.
So where we're at right now, I think for us, my comment here was more around the, not so much did this step fail, but just how's my deployment going, right? So much higher level things. Because I think there's the other level of abstraction, of course, which is, the guy who clicked the button, he wants to see every single step, and when it fails, he needs to be able to go, investigate what's going on. Right now, where we're at is, we're pretty well taking the output straight out of Rundeck and representing it, just in our own UI. It is too verbose right now. Even in our sort of trivial proof of concept demos, it's like, all right, this is a little bit too much. I'm not sure what it was. Some of the demo you showed where, each step was, had a title and you could flip back between, the execution and the definition. I thought that looked pretty good, right? It looked very intuitive, and I assumed that there was a way you could drill down into a single node. So you could just watch that node, it's on step 3, it's on step 4.
And call that a baby step, because we actually got some good sponsor development on simplifying the whole view. This is a user that their end users aren't really technical even.
Mm-hmm.
So they wouldn't know what any of those messages mean. And they just want to know, did it work or not? They don't even want to know a very low level of what worked or not either. They want kind of a very rolled up view of the job.
Green, yeah.
There's these rough steps, and it's spinning, check. Next step, spinning, check. That's all they want,
yeah.
And they want to be able to drill down from there. So that's really what's going to happen next, and that was just sort of a step in that direction. But that's what I think the non-techie end user wants. So we'll have different views of it, but that's a key view that these business users.
Another roll-up that I thought would be useful is, if you're doing, obviously once you get to a single node, I think it's really clear, right? You kind of want to see that, green, 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 red, and then drill down. But if I have 100 or 200 nodes, red, green isn't really enough, because if they're all failing on step 6, I care that one thing, but if they're failing in various ways, what's a good presentation for that? Just a thought we've had, I don't know that,
No, that's good. We took a couple of passes in the mock-ups on one of those cases of what logical step across all the nodes that they all seem to fail on, or some fail on. Yeah, so I know what you mean by kind of aggregating the result.
Right.
Yeah. One was the just show the difference. So if you've got 500 nodes, just show me the things that went different. Yeah, just show me the outliers. Don't show me all the ones that were the same.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a really good one.
Yeah. So it's kind of obvious that this is, I think, where we really want to push the future. Well, at least the next kind of major development of Rundeck is how do you handle these output screens? Because this is all about self-service. How do we make the automators look awesome? It's they can turn around to their boss and other people and give them cool shit, right?
Yeah.
So, that's really where we want to push it. So any recommendations or ideas or contributions or whatever we're.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that's really where we're at. Is we have a lot of attention during releases. I loved your canary line. Deployment problem is really just a canary for everything before it. I think the place where we win is when we say, "Don't ask me, go to this dashboard," and then they say, "Did you see the dashboard?" Right? That's really where I think you want to get to.
That's. We just did a case study thing with your colleagues over at Data.com, and that was Prakash's big thing was that they were doing the deployments, and something would go wrong, and everybody would have to throw them some link to something in Splunk or try to don't really see what was happening, where it's failed. So it was a major point of contention, and all kinds of bad things would come out of that. So he's like, hey, I can automate this stuff, anyway. But his big point of using Rundeck was giving everybody one screen to watch, so they could see what exactly was going on. So something failed, everybody knew what it was. So it was 100% of visibility. He was one of the guys who really turned our thinking around about this. That you know, the automation part, it's a solved problem. There's a million ways to do it. It's the visibility part that
Yeah.
he didn't have an answer for.
We should talk to him too.
Yeah, he has the same badge and everything.
You gonna sneak up on him and get into his building.
Yeah.
I can tell you from a visualization point of view, at least what we're hearing lately from our release managers is like, what I boil it down to is they would love to see a progress bar with like an ETA of like,
Yeah, it's like the Microsoft
Yeah.
installer. like-
Exactly.
Oh yes, we've all
if
spent
it just sits at 99% for 99% of the time.
Your
We're
grandkids
good.
will be still trying to figure out how to make a progress
Yeah.
bar that works.
Yeah.
Actually, I noticed you had a progress bar.
Yeah, and
What trickery did you?
Well, so what we do is we record every execution time
Statistical.
and statistically, so it's just a rough average. But the more you do it, maybe statistically it gets closer.
Actually, then it becomes interesting too. I would love to know on the sort of the 20-minute operation that, at minute 23 or whatever, it's like, whoa, you're statistically out of spec here. That's pretty cool.
Well, we have this program we call Show Us Your Rundeck.
Okay.
And this is kind of the ways we can talk to the users. And this comes up. They're like, yeah, okay, so it's great. On average, it's hitting it, but they want almost like an SPC chart. They're like, this is the mean, this is the max and min, and they want to know like deviation-wise for a job. And because people are adding steps, or they're changing the implementation of the step, or they add more nodes, or who knows what's going on, and they want to know, is the stability of the process predictable anymore? Or
I feel like that's like a hard, like when I think about all the dynamic configurations, if you're applying a job against different sets of nodes or half the nodes or whatever, like how do you even store that data and present it? Your averages, could be all over the place.
I think they just want to know when it's like kind of just a signal. Oh, it was kind of steady and now it's not.
Yeah, it's deviation from the norm.
Just to know that much was like important for them.
Yeah, it's already a nice tool. And when I first created like one general purpose job that I'd handle a lot of parameters into, but then I decided that I really liked seeing the progress bar be vaguely accurate, so I broke them up into separate jobs. Because like half the jobs would take a huge amount of time,
Right.
so it'd be short.
Yeah. It's so funny. I don't know. I'm a test now, but this is the same thing with testing. So if I've got a function or whatever, and it's fat, it's monolithic, and I test it, it's like, well, what the hell's going on here? I'm testing X step. What's going on in X step? So that makes me break it down, break a method or function down into smaller stuff. Like, that's the part that really sucks, or that's the part that's always variable. So I think getting visibility into the variation, is partly breaking it down right, but it's just being able to see it spiking up and down, and whether it's steady. That's the key part all the time. I almost got started on testing. Sorry.
Hold yourself in. One more beer.
Well, shall we call it a night here?
Sure.
Thanks so much for.
Thanks, Alex.